that we've now been talking about writing for a while, and everybody should know a little something about writing and a little bit about writing and revising and editing, which are really all one process. So I thought maybe it was time to road test what we know. And I then immediately thought of Mark Twain's dictum, write what you know, and it occurred to me that there could be no greater road test of things than writing the first paragraph of your memoir. Now, not everybody's going to go on to write a memoir, and I'm certainly not. But the idea, as an exercise, I think it pulls together everything essential about writing. And to me, the most essential part is not the words you choose, not where you start, which is a damn hard thing to decide to begin with. We'll get to that in a minute, and I can tell you about some of my choices, and I haven't landed yet. But like, what is it about your life that's worth telling? And you have to put an enormous amount of thinking into the project before you even sit down and write. And I guess that's one of the themes that I think is most important about writing, how damn hard it is and how much thinking goes into it. If you're a reporter, you have events breaking that supply you with the story of what you're writing about. That's not to say a lot of skill doesn't go into it. A lot of skill goes into how you choose to tell the story. But there are established conventions in journalism, and you're not penalized for following them. In fact, it's often wise and best to follow them because of reader expectations. But in any other kind of writing, you have millions of choices of how you tell your story, where you start your story. And in a memoir, that becomes, I would say, about a choice to the millionth power. And I'll tell you some of my own considerations, and maybe that will be instructive in how to think about this. But all the thinking that goes into this beforehand. So you're sitting down to write your memoir. Forget the words you're going to choose. Forget for now where you're going to start, how you're going to capture your readers, and how you're going to get to the rest of the story from where it is that you decide to start. But what is your life about? I'm still on that question, by the way, and I've been thinking about this for a while. What is your life about? What would captivate a reader? What makes your life worth telling? This is an exercise, so let's just assume that you have to fulfill the exercise. So you have to write the first paragraph of your memoir. Let's just make the assumption that there is something worthwhile about your life. And I would guarantee you that if you gave it some thought, you would find a way to think about your life, to extract some principles, some meaning from it that would make it of interest to somebody else. And, part of this is knowing what feedback you get from others when you tell portions of your story. Friends, parties, family gatherings. Sorry, you won't get much of a chance to do it this Thanksgiving, but we won't always have a pandemic on our hands. But what makes your life worth telling? What about it has something in it that others might be interested in? What are the themes of your life? And I mean, I'm still pondering those questions for myself, like what are the themes of my life? And you don't necessarily start out there though. So how do you think about it? And you could start linearly. My life began. And a memoir that I think about that started with I Was Born was Amos Oz's A Tale of Love and Darkness. And you better be as good a writer as Amos Oz to start with where you were born. And actually, his telling of where he was born, I don't know if any of you have read the memoir. It's one of my favorites. But he tells the story. He was born into a dank, dark, low-ceilinged room in Jerusalem, that where his parents slept on a sofa that filled up practically the entire room when it was opened. And when it was closed, the room was their living room, their bedroom, their gathering room, their everything room. And immediately you get the suffocating presence of that space and how it did not only suffocate him, give him that feeling of suffocation, but it literally suffocated his mother, who, when he was 13, killed herself. So he sets the scene spectacularly in one paragraph with this dark, low ceiling space. And I bet he thought for a very long time how to begin that book. So starting linearly, you can do, it's boring. People don't necessarily track on their lives in a linear way. At some point or other, you kind of have to go back to the beginning. I think my favorite recent opening of a memoir, and let me see if I can pull it up on my computer. Yeah, because I'll read to you the opening paragraph because it's just gorgeous. And then we can talk about why it works so magnificently as an opening paragraph of a memoir in particular is Jeanette Walls from The Glass Castle. And this is a book that still sells pretty well, but was on the New York Times bestseller list for, get this, over 400 consecutive weeks. Now that's a feat. That's really a feat. And when you read the first paragraph, hers is not the world's most interesting life. She's not the world's most accomplished human being. But when you read the first paragraph, I'll be damned if you're not going to be sucked into the story. And I'll read it to you because it's really very short. I was sitting in a taxi, wondering if I had overdressed for the evening, when I looked out the window and saw Mom rooting through a dumpster. It was just after dark. A blustery March wind whipped the steam coming out of the manholes, and people hurried along the sidewalks with their collars turned up. I was stuck in traffic 2 blocks from the party where I was heading. The next paragraph tells you that she was coming from her home on Park Avenue. And why I think this is so spectacular, an opening for a book, is that you are immediately drawn into how could someone who lives on Park Avenue, and Park Avenue is a symbol for wealth, having arrived, having made it. Park Avenue is it. It's a metaphor for all of those things. So here she is living on Park Avenue, and she's ducking in the back of a taxi, having just accidentally glimpsed her mother, a dumpster diva, rooting around. If I had read you the second paragraph of this opening, you would learn that her mother had rags tied around her shoulders, and that the author lived on Park Avenue. But why I think it's so spectacular an opening for a book is because immediately you know something about, you know that the author has made it. And immediately you know that there's something very dramatic going on in that life where her mother is rooting around in a dumpster. And immediately you want to know, how do these two things come together? How did the author come out of that, if indeed she came out of that? Or how did she, who was able to achieve, come from a family where a mother is just bedraggled and rooting around in dumpsters for survival purposes? So that, to me, is a gorgeous way to open a memoir, with this little incident in the back of a taxi, because it gives you immediately some of the elements of the life, and it opens your curiosity. How did they both get there? How did she get to Park Avenue? How did her mother get to, the dumpster? Where did they live most of their life? And here's the author going to a glittery party, wondering if she had overdressed, and there's a mother with rags, in the rooting around in the dumpster. I'm just curious whether anyone else has any other reactions or finds anything else in it, or finds nothing at all in that. I'm just curious. Any reactions from anyone else?
I find memoirs to be some of the most psychologically interesting books. And to me, that is, I went through a whole phase where I was really, reading memoirs. But reading them and writing them are very different, because you really have to dig into what's interesting. What I may find interesting about myself might be very uninteresting to the rest of the world. You really have to be able to, if you're writing a memoir about yourself, it's one thing, but if you're writing it about someone else, I have a question. My mother-in-law, for example, is a survivor of the Holocaust. She was in 2 concentration camps and working in a bomb factory. How do you tell that story from someone else's perspective using the technique that you just did? Can you give advice on that?
So I love the question you asked me about perspective, because that is one of the dominant questions. Like, what is the perspective that you take? And by the way, that holds for whatever it is you choose to write, but it's especially important in a memoir. And that's my difficulty in choosing and trying to find a starting place. So, you know, I don't think there's a pat answer to that question. And I think
So I stumped the editor.
You stumped the editor. There isn't a pat answer to the question because get this, you're going to have to stump yourself because you're going to have to try. This is a case where you're going to sit down with paper or computer and you're going to try several starts and you're going to discover that some of them go to blind alleys and some of them open more doors. And I don't think a priori anyone can say which route is going to be the open route for you. Because partly it's going to be the nature of the story.
You know what? I forgot. I got these. You can have this.
I'm sorry. What was that?
That was someone was unmuted without.
Oh, okay. So that's a case where, as in much writing, there's trial and error. You try things and know that doesn't work, and so you restart a paragraph. In this particular case, writing a life where you have infinite choices about how to tell it, and especially where to begin. Once you begin, you have that starting place, then you have a different set of choices. How from that starting place do you get to the rest of the story? And then from there, you're going to have sequentially you're going to have cascades of different questions open as you go. But so that big question is, where am I going to start? And unless you've been mulling this over for 10 years and knowing exactly the entry point you have to the story of your life, and that makes the rest of it flower, you're going to be spending a lot of time rolling up paper into a ball and tossing it into a wastebasket, metaphorically. And by the way, save all the false starts. Just have a file of them because they're going to have things in them that you're going to need. And I think this is true with most writing. My way of doing it is I tend to put things I'm cutting out at the bottom of a piece of copy that I'm writing. Of course, sometimes you're writing a piece of copy and it gets too long. And so you can start a file of false starts or possibles or reserve for review or something like that. But it's absolutely necessary because there's usually something usable, even in what doesn't lead you forward. So with your mother-in-law story, a good place for that to start would be with a microphone, would be with an interview. I don't know if you've done that. And here's why I say that, because that was such a searing experience for many people that their memories of it tend to open up, if they're going to open up, and sometimes they don't. If they're going to open up, they might open up as they go along. And by the way, that's true of everybody with everything. You know, someone might say, oh, I don't remember anything about the experience. And then they remember one thing, and then they get into that one thing. And that begins to open other doors and windows in memory. And which is why it's necessary to do these kinds of interviews over time, because you can't just get it all in one gob at one time, because you ask a few questions and then you talk for maybe an hour, and then you go back a few days later, and that person may have spent some time thinking, some doors may have opened, and you get the story. And so I would start with a microphone and getting that story. There's some really inexpensive online transcription services. And when I say inexpensive, I mean $10 for an hour's worth of material. You have to go over it because transcriptions are imperfect. The AI that's used is quite imperfect, but it's usually, and especially going to be especially imperfect if someone has an accent. But it's worth doing and worth going over the transcripts. And then you begin to see things. You begin to see themes. You begin to get a perspective. You begin to get the story, the picture of someone's life. And I guess with that, you don't only want to know, and this is with everything, and especially a memoir, you don't only want the details of what happened, you want to know what was going on inside someone's head, because we know that the experience was horrific in many ways. We also know people found ways internally to survive that. So you want to find out what was going on and how that experience was being interpreted. It was probably harder for some people than for others. The contrast, but also being together with other people and just little things. I mean, you hear stories. We all know the stories, how people would sometimes start singing. They could barely walk and they would sing. And they did things to keep alive flames. And those are the stories that are really worth, that's really why it's worth telling those stories, because we've all heard the Holocaust stories, and yet everyone is different, because how they kept the flame alive is really very instructive for all of us. And how getting out what they did, I mean, connecting back with the people of their life. I'm thinking of a friend of mine in Amsterdam who was a child who, how do you even know who and where your family is, and how do you get back with them, and all the reunifications that it took? Those stories are really kind of amazing, and every one of them breaks my heart. So those are the things that are important to tell, and you really want to reawaken memories. And I just think doing it with the microphone is by far the finest way to go and start that process. And it's a particular, you can almost say genre of story. Because we all know some of the details, and we're all braced, for the Sophie's Choices. We don't know. These are not stories of joy, and yet they are stories of triumph. And they're really important to tell for that reason. But my advice to you is get out a microphone and start. And then after you gather enough material, have enough, I hate to reduce it to this, but have enough stories. And you don't only want to know what happened there, but before and adjusting to it, and then what happened afterwards and adjusting to life outside. You want to know what was really significant and important about that particular story. And again, that's something you're going to have to mine for yourself and find. And then once you decide on what that element is, then your interviewing becomes a little bit more pointed, as it were. It becomes a little more directed, because you want to get more, you're more curious about a very specific thing. And you can ask lots of questions coming from lots of different directions, because remember, these are memories which people didn't want to keep in the foreground of their lives because they could be incapacitating. And so you want to come at it from as many angles as possible. And just from what we know about memory in the brain and how memories are stored in the brain, we know about these large associative networks. And you want to take advantage of that knowledge and come at it through any possible way and find out what the associative notes are, what the keys are. And I bet you're going to find that in your conversations, there are going to be some words or some events or some thoughts that are really going to strike a chord with your mother-in-law, and that will either open her up a little more or close her down a little more, but that will be more salient than some others. So, but as you know, there's a genre of Holocaust stories, and we need them and want them, not just for the historical detail, but for the triumph of what does it take to triumph in about the most adverse circumstances we can come up with, programmed death for some people, and that some people survive that. We just can't seem to get enough of that story. And maybe we shouldn't get it. Maybe there is not enough of that story. Maybe there is not too much of that story. But there are lots of other stories to tell. And I'm particularly fond of the beginning of Jeanette Walls' memoir. Here's a person, as I said, she may not be the world's most accomplished human being, the most important human being, no Nobel Prizes or anything like that, but she's just got this real contrast in that really captivates you, and it intrigues you because you want to know how she got to her position and how her mother got to hers, and how she can reconcile the two in her head. The fact that she slithers down into the taxi to avoid seeing her mother, I don't know about you, but I think it's a kind of experience we can all relate to in some way. I know I've done it in other circumstances, seeing someone on the street for other reasons and ducking down into a taxi or turning my head so that I can't be visible. So I think that the shame element of that speaks to something in all of us. And I want to say something about the writer. To her credit, later in the short first chapter, she actually has lunch with her mother and tells her mother that she saw her on the street while she was going to this party. She saw her mother on the street from the back seat of a taxi. And her mother says to her, "Why didn't you say hi?" And to the writer's enormous credit and character, she says to her mother, "Because I was so ashamed." And it was going to knock the writer off her going to a party, and because she just would face all that shame. But to her credit, she told her mother that her mother's, in a kind way, "Because I felt ashamed of what you were doing." And then that just opens up into the rest of the book. And, you know, and that sets off a whole other chain of decisions. But that important decision of what part, what point, what moment or place or thing. I think in Tobias Wolff's book, This Boy's Life, it's a place. He and his mother are stuck on the road on their way to Moab, Utah, in a car that keeps breaking down and overheating. So you get this sense of breaking down on the road in the West, where they're going to seek their fortune, and just this pathetic car they're in that no one will fix. And so their only way of dealing with it is stopping every time the car overheats. And so you get the desperation from that scene setting. So yet it's a scene from him, a moment of his life as a 10-year-old in the car with his mother. So you make that decision, where do you start? And let's say you make the decision and you find that one point in your life. It doesn't have to be a point in your life where everything comes together. It just has to be the point in your life where that's something that illustrates something about your life. It doesn't have to illustrate the major theme. It doesn't have to be grand, but it has to be captivating or really important to the story you're telling. So here's this Tobias Wolff telling the story of this 10-year-old, you know, in this jalopy going to seek fortune in a uranium mining town, and their car breaking down all the time. And you really just get the desperation it takes to have to be on the road, you know, as a grown-up woman with your 10-year-old kid in a car that's just going to sputter out every few miles. And that desperation pervades portions of his childhood. And that sets the theme for later. And he doesn't have to tell you in words that there was desperation. He said it in a scene. And so you pick that one point that's going to open up things. Doesn't have to open everything up, but it opens up into things that are important in your story. And then you have all the decisions to make of like, okay, from here, how do I get to where sooner or later you're going to get back to the beginning? And probably sooner, because you really don't want to tell the end part of your life before you tell the beginning part of your life. And and even then, even in telling a story linearly, it isn't going to be linear because you can't tell everything at the same time. There are lots of threads and lots of themes in a life that are worth talking about, and they have to be dealt with sequentially, in some sequential fashion. So stories are really never linear when they're told on the page, and even in movies, even in film. So those are some of the early decisions to make. And I don't know if anyone is on here who is actually grappling with making decisions about a memoir, but I was trying to think about my own life. Where would I start? And in thinking about where I would start, one of the ways that one thing that helps us think about this is that we have friends and family that we talk to, and we get feedback about our stories often, about our experiences. We recount experiences. And so we get feedback, and people say, "Oh my God, you should write a book about that." I can't tell you how much of a period of my life for 5 years where I was the entertainment committee for my friends, talking about my dating life. And this is after my husband died. And as a conscious adult, I decided, while I was getting on with my life, I decided I wanted to date again. And, I had some amazing experiences, hilarious. And I guess the tellings, like all tellings, tell as much about you as they do about the experience and the other person. But so that large chunk of feedback I got, was sitting in this corner of my head. But is that really the theme of my life? Not really. So, and is it really an important theme of my life? It doesn't have to be the theme. Not really. It's a set of experiences in my life. And, when you're dating as an adult, that helps you define yourself. And you don't know that going into it, but you find that, and as you go along. And by the way, all dating does, even when you're 20, but you just don't realize it when you're 20. You're not so defined that it matters. You're less formed usually. And so you might not have as many preconceived ideas of what you need. Anyway, so the dating experience as a conscious adult was a big period, a big experience of my life, laden with feedback and very, very interesting, fun, and often exciting stories. But really, was that my life? Was that even an important part of my life? What was? I really, there were many things I've thought about. So one of the themes of my life, should I start when I was 17 years old? And I went during the summer, I went to a party with friends, and I came home probably about 1 o'clock in the morning, and I drove home and walked in the front door of the house and was immediately assaulted by my older brother, who dragged me downstairs to the basement and beat me up. that was a pretty intense experience of my life. And it capsulized what I think of as a major theme in my life of having an older brother who was kind of like the star of the household and being a female who was granted second-class citizenship, but found first-class citizenship in life. And I don't single myself out. I tell that story only because that is the story of so many women, and in one way or another. And mine had a particular flavor, and flavor with a few twists, and some of them are funny, and P.S. I made it. So we all know how that story ends. So but that was a really big theme of my life, because as everybody knows, the experience of successful women in the world has not always been, to be greeted with open arms and rah-rah, and here we're opening the door and every pathway, choose your pathway, and the world is open to you. You got to bang on a lot of doors in order to open them, and sometimes they shut in your face, even when you're doing more and better things than the guys. And I'm not saying it to make my story exclusive. I think it's a lot of people's stories, and mine has unique flavors to it. And so that's one theme. And starting there but I felt starting there would have given undue emphasis to that. And it's not the dominant theme of my life. And at this moment, I couldn't tell you what is. But I had lots of other thoughts. One of my thoughts was, do I start with a quote, the last line of when I decided to date and went online and I wrote a profile, and the last line of my profile just had a certain spirit and captured something about me as a word person that created almost an avalanche of responses when I first went online, but said something essential, two things essential about me. And the end of the last line was, and if he were a Scrabble player, well, anything might be possible. So you have the open-ended possibilities and openness to experience, and you have the word thing, with Scrabble. So it was just a line that opened into, in a sense, my rebirth, as it were, and a line that could just capture a lot about me. And then I thought about it, and I thought, nah, the whole dating experience and being reborn isn't even the theme of my life, or even an important theme. It happened along the way. So I'm still thinking about it, but I tell you this as a way of conveying how much thinking has to go into what you're doing even before you put the first word onto the document. And I think that's what most people vastly, vastly underestimate. What's my life about? What makes it worthy of telling? What are the important themes of my life? And the themes don't have to be, themes of glory or anything like that, but the themes, your own understanding of your own life, because that's important to other people too, because everybody is trying to understand themselves and their own life. So that's kind of my message. I don't know if anyone's been thinking about their own memoir for a while. I've never thought of memoir as a genre for me. I do not journal. As I've said before, I write emails, and I haven't, for the past year, or maybe the past 9 months, my emails have not been as discursive as they frequently are, because I've just been on this journey of displacement, and so much is taken up with matters relating to being displaced and getting back home. And I won't bore you with that, but so emails became, in a way, my journal. It was my outlet for summing up things and summing up my life. And it was especially more so in periods of turmoil, such as in the year or two after my husband died. And then while I was given the opportunity to live in New Mexico for a year, which was fun and just something I would never have done at any other time. And that too might be a great place to start my memoir, with an absolutely silly experience that has nothing at all to do really with anything else in my story, but it's just a very funny story of not being able to get my credit card sent to me while I was living in New Mexico, because the credit card people thought New Mexico was not part of the United States. And in a way, Taos, New Mexico is about the most alien environment to New York City. And I was going back and forth between the two at the time. So that has potential as a place to start for telling the story of my life, because it kind of does divide my life, into the first half and the second half. First half and second half, not temporally, but in terms of, the crazy trip I've been on. So that's it, I think, for just as a starter. Even I'm not a memoir writer, but it's such a great exercise, because it's everything by every means it has to be pulled together into one paragraph. And once you figure out what some of the things are in your life and what's important, what's meaningful to you, what would be meaningful to someone else, that's all before you get to how do I structure the sentences? What's my opening word? What words do I use? What's the rhythm of the sentences? What tone do I take? What voice do I develop? Whose perspective? To get back to Debbie's opening question, what perspective? That becomes an enormous question. In any story you tell, except if you're a journalist, you're reporting from this neutral perspective as a journalist most times. That's kind of loosened up a little bit in recent years. But the decision of whose perspective is almost, in a way, that's the novelist's fabulous dilemma. And that question, as I said, there's no answer. There's no pat answer. It's going to depend on whose story is the richest, whether you're observing it, whether you're inside it, whether the story happened to you, whether the events happened to you, whether you observed it in someone else, whether you're the person listening to your mother-in-law, or whether your life was inside happened because of those events, which it didn't in your case. You grew up with that not happening to your life growing up, but it did to your husband's. And so those are all the wonderful things that go into writing a lousy 50-word or 100-word or even a 10-word paragraph. All of that has to go on first. And I mean, I could tell you more about thoughts of mine, but I'd love to hear thoughts from anybody else who's ever sat down and tried to write anything besides how I spent my summer vacation.
Hey, Hera, this is Jax. So I have a question for you. What would you say the biggest difference is between an autobiography and a memoir? Because I understand that they're both written by the individual, but I'm not understanding because I've always wanted to write an autobiography, but as I'm hearing you talk about a memoir, I feel like that might be more in line with what I should write.
Why have you always wanted to write an autobiography?
Because I was understanding an autobiography was a way for me to tell my story of my life to the world, basically. But that's the same thing as a memoir, is it not?
Well, a memoir doesn't necessarily always tell all of your life in a story, whereas an autobiography usually sets out to tell your life up until a point or in sequences. You know, an autobiography could take several books if you're Winston Churchill, you know, and have that big a life. What about your life do you feel warrants an autobiography?
I don't think that now that you've said that, I don't think an autobiography would be the best. I think memoir, because my life, as you've been talking, some of the things that I was writing down, I believe that I need to identify the important themes. And I think that finding 3 to 5 specific memories or shifts that were pivotal in my life is what I need to focus on. I think that would be more impactful. Because there's been specific things in my life that you can see, and it was because of this happening that there was a huge shift in my life. I think that's where my story needs to come from instead of a start to finish, like an autobiography is how I'm understanding it. Yeah.
Right. And I mean, some memoirs you could say are really autobiographies, but a memoir is more, we think of an autobiography as being a recounting of factual experiences, even though they're explored. A memoir we think of as being more reflective and opening up the meanings of experiences, just as you are explaining to me here. You've had these pivotal experiences, and that's really more memoir material, because you open that up. Memoir itself is memory. It's an internal event. And so you're opening up the meaning of it. And yes, there are important things that happen, which is, you know, why we want to hear from someone. But there are people whose memoirs, and it's the fault of the way my memory works, that don't spring to mind immediately. But there are people who've written memoirs that are stunning, who have not been the world's most accomplished people and wouldn't have an autobiography on paper, but who are such exquisite spelunkers and explorers of the mind and of their own experience, that we're captivated by their memoirs. And so once you start seeing them as one is opening up internal experiences and exploring the meaning of events, rather than the autobiography being a retelling of worldly events, of course, interacting, with one's interpretation of those experiences, you begin to see how the two diverge. And what you're talking about sounds much more like memoir than autobiography.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
And by the way, guys, we're running out of time, but the one thing I want to do is I'm going to read you the opening paragraph of a memoir, and I want you all to guess whose it is. Okay? I don't do it for the money. I've got enough, much more than I'll ever need. I do it to do it. Deals are my art form. Other people paint beautifully on canvas or write wonderful poetry. I like making deals, preferably big deals. That's how I get my kicks. Most people are surprised by the way I work. I play it very loose. I don't carry a briefcase. I try not to schedule too many meetings. I leave my door open. You can't be imaginative or entrepreneurial if you've got too much structure. I prefer to come to work each day and just see what develops. Guess who?
That's a tough one. The first person that popped into my mind was Trump because
of course.
Deals. Yeah, but
is
it really? Oh, yeah. Yay!
Yeah, that's who it is. I didn't think anyone would have too much trouble with that. But the hilarious thing is the opening line, I don't do it for the money. This guy does everything for the money. I mean, it's just the exact opposite. But, in a way, it's really very honest as a memoir because he says, I prefer to come to work each day and just see what develops. Well, that's the presidency we have. He just comes to work each day. There's no plan. There's no policy. There's no structure. It's like, what have the Iranians put on my desk this day? What's happening in the world?
I think what you just showed us is that a memoir is our own memory, right? And our own perspective in however we're going to be reflecting on something. Whereas an autobiography, you're going to try to take maybe a perspective of fact. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Like Marie Curie, her daughter wrote her autobiography, right? It was actually a biography, but it was touted as an autobiography, right?
Right.
But that went through a sort of a timeline with fact. Is that so? Am I?
Yeah, that's definitely the case.
Okay.
Yeah, and historians will mine autobiographies because they are, recitations of fact that might not be known any other way, and details and minutiae of experience. But a memoir is just this kind of digressive internal meditation on experience. And that kind of really wraps it up.
Yeah, this was great. I really appreciate this. Anybody have any questions before we end today?
I hate ending with Trump, but I mean, it's kind of like...
We're not. We're ending with memoir versus autobiography.
Right, yes,
so
yes.
Unless somebody else has another question, and then we'll end on that.
Not a question, just wanted to say thank you. This has been amazing. Thank you, Hera.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hera. So until next week.
Right. See you next week.
You take care.
You too. Bye.